Among the many legends that emerged after World War II, few have captured the popular imagination like the idea that the Nazis built flying saucers. In sensational post-war magazines, in dubious documentaries, and in countless conspiracy theories, it is repeated that the Third Reich developed circular aircraft capable of flying at supersonic speeds, maneuvering at impossible angles, and, some say, even reaching into space. The fantasy of an interplanetary Nazi fleet became part of wartime folklore, portraying Hitler and his engineers as pioneers of a futuristic technology that was supposedly hidden after the defeat. The origin of this myth lies in a mixture of propaganda, misinterpreted rumors, and the aura of secrecy surrounding German military projects. During the war, the Reich invested enormous resources in wonder weapons, the so-called Wunderwaffen, ranging from V-2 rockets to jet aircraft. In this realistic context of technological innovation, it was easy for rumors about unusual-looking experimental craft to spread. Some patents and sketches by engineers such as Rudolf Schriever and Meter were reinterpreted decades later as evidence of alleged Nazi UFOs, when in reality they were marginal projects, with no concrete results or functional prototypes. The Cold War further fueled this belief. In the 1950s and 1960s, as the United States and the Soviet Union competed for technological supremacy, the tabloid press found it profitable to attribute to the Nazis secrets that had allegedly been inherited by the superpowers. Every sighting of an unidentified flying object could be linked to the idea that it originated from German designs recovered after 1945. There were even stories of hidden bases in Antarctica, where the Nazis supposedly continued their experiments in circular craft. None of this stood up to historical verification, but it served as a fantastical tale in a world fascinated by UFOs. Available documents and testimonies from the time make it clear that German engineers faced more immediate problems, keeping their air force operational, addressing fuel shortages, and mass-producing conventional aircraft that could compete with the Allies. The Reich's industrial resources in 1944 and 1945 were on the verge of collapse. To think that, under these conditions, they could manufacture fleets of flying saucers is an exaggeration that ignores logistical reality. At most, there were models and aerodynamic experiments with circular shapes, something that also occurred in other countries, without ever materializing into anything practical. At the end of the 20th century, popular culture consolidated the image of Nazi UFOs. Books, comics, and films turned them into an attractive narrative device. The defeated enemy reappeared as possessing hidden technologies, a threat that never completely disappeared. Fiction blended with history to the point that many people began to assume that some truth must exist. But the truth is that, beyond some drawings and unreliable statements, there is no solid evidence to support the existence of these aircraft. When the ship sinks, Hitler's alleged flight to Argentina, few conspiracy theories have been as persistent as the one claiming that Adolf Hitler did not die in the Berlin bunker in April 1945, but rather managed to escape and take refuge in Argentina. Over the decades, this story has fueled books, documentaries, and rumors featuring fake images, dubious testimonies, and alleged evidence of his hidden life in Patagonia. For many, the idea that the most feared dictator of the 20th century could have survived adds an air of mystery to the war's end, transforming the tragedy into an endless intrigue. The origin of the myth dates back to the chaos of the final days of the Third Reich. When Berlin was besieged by the Red Army, communications were disrupted, and versions of Hitler's death took time to be confirmed. The Führer's body was partially cremated in the gardens of the Chancellery, making immediate identification difficult. This lack of conclusive images opened up a perfect space for speculation. During the Cold War, the Soviet Union, keen to maintain a certain ambiguity, did not provide all the information about the remains, and this opacity allowed popular imagination to fill the void. In Argentina, a country that did receive numerous Nazi fugitives after the war, the theory found fertile ground. Cases such as that of Adolf Eichmann, captured in Buenos Aires in 1960, or Josef Mengele, who hid for years in South America, demonstrated that the continent was a refuge for Reich criminals. This historical reality fueled the fantasy that if others had succeeded, Hitler had too. Rumors grew with stories of alleged secret stays in Bariloche, manipulated photographs, and testimonies from elderly people who claim to have seen him. More recent research has shown otherwise. In 2018, a team of French scientists accessed tooth fragments preserved in Russian archives and concluded, through forensic studies, that they undoubtedly belonged to Hitler. The dental characteristics matched the dental records of his personal dentist and confirmed his death in Berlin in 1945. Even the skull, although controversial regarding its authenticity, was not necessary to corroborate the essential point: the Nazi leader did not survive the war. The persistence of the myth is also explained by a psychological need. For many, it was difficult to accept that a man responsible for millions of deaths could have met such a swift and banal end, a suicide in a basement surrounded by rubble. The escape to Argentina, on the other hand, offers a more dramatic story, fraught with persecution, international conspiracies, and unspeakable secrets. That type of narrative is much more appealing to the collective imagination than simple, documented truth. Popular culture consolidated the fable. Novels, films, and television programs turned the hypothesis into a narrative device exploited to exhaustion. Hitler in Patagonia, Hitler in a secret base, Hitler hiding among Nazi sympathizers. Each version added a new twist to a story that, although unreal, seemed to refuse to die. But the historical evidence is overwhelming and leaves no room for doubt. The German dictator took his own life in Berlin in April 1945, and the rest belongs to the realm of speculation and fiction. Flying to die. Did Japanese kamikazes really take drugs before missions? Among the most striking images of World War II is that of the Japanese kamikaze pilots, those young men who plunged to their deaths against enemy ships in legendary suicide attacks motivated by honor. The ferocity of their missions gave rise to one of the most repeated legends, that they were drugged before takeoff, stunned by substances that nullified their fear of death. This myth, widespread especially in the West, reinforces the idea that these men were chemically controlled puppets, incapable of making decisions for themselves. In reality, kamikazes were not given hallucinogenic drugs or narcotics to carry out their mission. Their training followed a much more complex cultural, political, and military framework. Japan, steeped in Bushido, the samurai code of honor, viewed death in combat as a noble sacrifice, a way to preserve personal and family honor. Added to this was the ultra-nationalist education of the time, which exalted duty to the emperor as a form of almost religious devotion. The kamikaze mission was presented as an act of supreme heroism, capable of giving meaning to the impending defeat. Testimonies from survivors, mechanics, and officers confirm that before departing, the pilots often received farewell ceremonies with sake, tea, or traditional foods. Occasionally, they were given a small ration of alcohol as a symbolic gesture, but not intended to alter their consciousness or induce a trance. Far from being drugged, many suicide bombers wrote farewell letters to their families, poems, and diaries in which they clearly expressed their emotions: fear, pride, doubt, and conviction. Their lucidity is captured in these documents, which contradicts the image of them as unconscious automatons under the influence of drugs. The drug myth probably originated in the Allied need to explain the incomprehensible. For American or British soldiers trained in a different military mentality, it seemed irrational that a young man would deliberately crash into an enemy ship. Attributing it to drugs offered a simple, exotic, and reassuring explanation. It wasn't willpower, but chemical manipulation. Over time, this version became popular in newspapers, post-war books, and later in audio-visual productions that sought to portray the war in terms of extreme cultural contrasts. War propaganda also helped cement this perception. The Allies portrayed the kamikazes as irrational fanatics, and the image of drug-addled young men fit that mold perfectly. It was easier to demonize them than to acknowledge the social and political context that drove them to sacrifice themselves. In the process, the pilots were dehumanized, erasing their agency and reducing them to mere instruments of a desperate strategy. In practice, kamikaze attacks responded to a specific military calculation. Japan could not compete with the industrial and technological superiority of the United States. Faced with the loss of aircraft carriers, experienced pilots, and resources, combat suicide became a tactical resource that sought to inflict as much damage as possible on the Allied fleet. Although heartbreaking and tragic, it relied not on drugs but on the discipline, ideology, and strategic desperation of an empire in retreat. The horror from beyond the grave, the strange hypothesis that the Nazis invented zombies. Among the many exaggerations attributed to the Third Reich, one of the most extravagant is that the Nazis invented zombies or that they conducted experiments to create armies of the living dead. This idea has been exploited in comics, horror films, and video games to the point of becoming a cultural subgenre. Nazis as supernatural villains who blend science, the occult, and reanimated corpses. Although entertaining in fiction, this belief lacks any real historical basis. The myth finds its roots in two distinct phenomena. On the one hand, the documented interest of some Nazi leaders in the occult and pseudosciences, especially within the SS, with figures like Heinrich Himmler obsessed with Germanic mysticism. This fondness for the esoteric generated rumors of secret experiments in castles or occult laboratories, which supposedly sought to manipulate life and death. On the other hand, after the war, writers and filmmakers began to merge these elements with popular legends about zombies of Caribbean origin, especially after American cinema popularized the figure of the living dead in the 1930s and 1940s. During World War II, Germany did indeed conduct atrocious medical experiments in concentration camps, many of them aimed at testing human resistance to extreme conditions, studying infectious diseases, or justifying racial theories. These horrors, extensively documented at the Nuremberg trials, have served as a backdrop for imagining even more sinister scenarios. However, no serious documents or reliable testimonies speak of attempts to revive corpses or create zombie armies. The mix between real science and myth was consolidated much later, when exploitation cinema looked for the Nazis as perfect antagonists for any terrifying fantasy. This was also fueled by the extravagant idea that the Nazis might have learned zombification techniques in Africa, where certain witch doctors were said to be able to possess a man's body to use as a slave. However, this is due to historical confusion and a blending of cultures, as the idea of the possessed zombie comes from Haiti, where the figure of the undead used as a slave by a witch doctor or shaman is part of local folklore in beliefs contained within Haitian voodoo and the Bakongo religion. This myth impacted the American soldiers who occupied Haiti between 1915 and 1934, who spread stories of supposed zombies upon their return to the United States, generating a cultural impact. In the post-war period, with the Cold War underway, the victorious powers also cultivated rumors about the Reich's secret advances. If the Nazis had created ballistic missiles, jet aircraft, and chemical weapons, why wouldn't they have attempted something as grotesque as controlling death? From this arose stories about their supposed connection to necromancy experiments, fueled by the silence that still surrounded many classified archives. The information vacuum was easily filled with fiction presented as a possibility. Popular culture eventually enshrined the idea. Low-budget films from the 1970s onward featured Nazi scientists reanimating bodies in underground laboratories. 21st century war and horror video games repeated the pattern, creating an entire parallel mythology in which defeated German soldiers returned as zombies to continue fighting. This narrative device not only exaggerated the Reich's scientific capabilities, but also gave it a supernatural dimension that never existed. Any given day, was the Normandy landing the beginning of the Nazi defeat? On June 6, 1944, the shores of Normandy became the scene of one of the most famous episodes of World War II, D-Day. Hundreds of thousands of Allied soldiers landed on fortified beaches under enemy fire in what was the largest amphibious operation in history. Over time, this event became a symbol of the beginning of the end of Nazism. However, attributing the German defeat solely to Normandy is a simplification that ignores the true course of the war. The idea that Normandy marked the beginning of the fall of the Reich responds more to the Western narrative than to military reality. Since long before June 1944, Germany was already in retreat. The turning point had occurred on the Eastern Front. The defeat at Stalingrad in early 1943 broke the German strategic initiative. From there, the Red Army launched an unstoppable offensive that pushed German forces westward. Colossal battles like Kursk consolidated Soviet superiority in men, weapons, and resources, sealing a fate that not even the massive influx of American troops could radically alter. Normandy, without a doubt, was crucial in accelerating the defeat and opening a second front that forced Hitler to redistribute forces. But by that time, the Reich was already exhausted. The air war had devastated its cities and industries, oil was scarce, and the Wehrmacht was suffering enormous losses on multiple fronts. The true beginning of the end had occurred years earlier, when Germany failed in its attempt to invade the Soviet Union and lost the strategic initiative in the East. The myth of Normandy as a turning point was consolidated especially in the West. For the United States and the United Kingdom, it was important to highlight their role in the Nazi defeat and construct a heroic narrative showing how they liberated Europe from tyranny. Hollywood, with epic films and official documentaries, helped cement in the collective memory the idea that the landing was the key to victory. In this process, the Soviet role was reduced and a simpler and more accessible narrative was created for Western audiences. However, Operation Overlord did have indisputable strategic value, as it opened a logistical corridor that allowed the liberation of France and the Allies to enter the heart of Europe. Furthermore, it demonstrated the Allied powers' capacity for coordination and material superiority, with a war machine that Germany could no longer match. However, it was not the beginning of the defeat, but rather the confirmation of a defeat that was already underway. The Red Tsunami. Why so many people believe the Soviets won only because of the size of their infantry. One of the most repeated assertions after World War II is that the Soviet Union defeated Nazi Germany solely thanks to the overwhelming number of soldiers it threw at the Eastern Front. According to this simplified version, the Red Army would have won through human saturation, sacrificing millions of lives until the enemy was exhausted. While it is true that Soviet losses were colossal and that numerical advantage played an important role, reducing their victory to a matter of human mass ignores decisive factors of strategy, technology, and organization. The image of the sea of soldiers originated in part in German propaganda, which sought to justify defeat by an impossible-to-contain barbarian horde. It was also useful in Western discourse during the Cold War, presenting the Soviet victory as a primitive triumph of quantity over quality. However, military archives and studies show that beyond the number of combatants, the Soviet Union managed to adapt and transform its war machine with an effectiveness that surprised even its allies. At the start of the German invasion in 1941, the Red Army was ill-prepared, disorganized, and suffered devastating defeats. But within a few years, it undertook a massive restructuring. The USSR moved its industry to the Urals and Siberia, far from the reach of the Luftwaffe. Mass production of weapons began there that rivaled Germany's. The T-34 tanks, simple to manufacture and repair, were more maneuverable than many enemy armored vehicles. Soviet artillery, organized in huge concentrations, became a decisive factor in offensives. Furthermore, the Air Force managed to recover and deploy fighters and bombers that gradually leveled the skies. Military leadership was also key. Commanders like Zhukov, Rokossovsky, and Konev learned from initial mistakes and developed in-depth war tactics, combining infantry, tanks, and artillery in large-scale operations. The victory at Stalingrad and the Kursk offensive were not simple demonstrations of brute force, but examples of strategic planning and an army that had learned to coordinate movements on a continental scale. Another decisive factor was morale. Although millions of Soviets died in combat or in the siege of cities like Leningrad, the regime's propaganda and a sense of national survival fueled unwavering resistance. For many, the war was literally a struggle for existence, as the Nazi occupation meant extermination and slavery. This collective commitment cannot be explained solely in terms of numbers. Of course, the number of men mobilized was enormous. The USSR recruited more than 30 million citizens into its war effort, a figure Germany was never able to match. But these soldiers were not indiscriminately thrown to their deaths, as is so often caricatured. The evolution of the Red Army demonstrates constant learning and an intelligent use of resources that ultimately broke the Wehrmacht. The Führer's Clause. Is it true that the Nazis planned to conquer the entire world? One of the most widespread beliefs about the Third Reich is that Hitler and his regime aimed to conquer the entire planet, imposing a global empire under the swastika. This vision, repeated in simplified manuals, films, and propaganda speeches, presents the Nazis as a force with universal aspirations, capable of extending its dominion from Europe to the Americas, Africa, and Asia. However, historical documents and statements by its leaders reveal a much more limited project focused on Europe and certain strategic territories. but far from a realistic plan for world domination. The central concept of Nazi ideology was Lebensraum, living space, which we will discuss in depth later. For now, it is essential to highlight what Hitler proposed from the time he wrote his famous book, Mein Kampf. Germany needed to expand eastward to guarantee resources and territory for its population. This expansion was to be achieved at the expense of the Soviet Union, whose territories would be colonized, its Slavic inhabitants turned into serfs, and much of the Jewish population exterminated. The focus was on Ukraine, Belarus, and European Russia, not the Americas or East Asia. The goal was to build a continental, not a global empire. In the West, Hitler's ambitions were more pragmatic than expansionist. His main interest was to neutralize France and ensure that Great Britain accepted a subordinate role in the new Germany-dominated Europe. Although there were plans to invade the British Isles, such as Operation Celian, they were never carried out due to the impossibility of defeating the Royal Navy and controlling the English Channel. After the aerial defeat in 1940, Hitler preferred to focus his attention on invading the USSR, demonstrating that the overall project was more of an illusion than a concrete strategy. As for America, Allied propaganda insisted on the idea that Hitler sought to extend his dominion to that continent. Falsified maps were presented showing South America divided into German protectorates, with Nazi military bases in the Atlantic. These images served to mobilize American public opinion, but they lacked any real basis. Germany never had the logistical or military capacity to extend beyond Europe and North Africa, much less to invade the American continent. The only attempts at action outside the European framework were limited and tactical. In Africa, the Africa Corps campaign under Rommel sought to control Egypt and the Suez Canal, more for strategic supply reasons than out of African imperial ambition. In Asia, the Nazis delegated responsibility for confronting the Allies in the Pacific to Japan. The supposed coordination to divide the world was more a propaganda wish than a reality. The image of a plan for world domination was consolidated after the war, fueled by the need to present the Nazis as an absolute threat with unlimited aspirations. In that narrative, Allied heroism appeared even more justified. They had faced not only a brutal regime in Europe, but an enemy that dreamed of subjugating the entire planet. But Reich documents reveal a radically brutal project, yes, albeit confined to Europe and certain strategic routes, with no capacity or viable plans for global expansion. Shadow of the Empire, the extravagant lie that the Gestapo was huge and omnipresent. In the popular imagination, the Gestapo appears as a gigantic organization with thousands of agents infiltrated in every corner of Germany, capable of monitoring every citizen and crushing any dissent. Post-war cinema, literature, and propaganda consolidated the image of an omnipresent secret police force exercising absolute control over German society. However, the reality was much more complex. The Gestapo was feared, yes, but its power was based more on citizen perception and collaboration than on a massive, omnipotent structure. The Gestapo was created in 1933, shortly after Hitler took power. Its function was to eliminate all forms of political opposition and ensure absolute loyalty to the regime. Under the command of figures such as Hermann Göring first and Heinrich Himmler later, it became an essential instrument of Nazi terror. However, in concrete numbers, it was never as large an organization as is often believed. In 1939, for example, it had around 7,000 staff members for a country of tens of millions of inhabitants. Even at the height of the war, the number of personnel never reached figures that justified the idea of a total control apparatus. However, what did exist was a system of widespread collaboration as the Gestapo encouraged denunciations and complaints among neighbors, co-workers, and even family members who reported suspicious behavior, critical comments, or behavior considered unpatriotic for paltry rewards such as money or food, or simply out of fear of being persecuted themselves. Many investigations were initiated not by active surveillance by agents, but by voluntary denunciations. In this way, the secret police amplified its capacity for action without needing an army of official informants. The repression worked because citizens internalized fear and, in many cases, actively participated in the repressive machinery. The perception of omnipresence was reinforced by methods of extreme brutality. Once someone fell into the hands of the Gestapo, the consequences were terrible. Violent interrogations, torture, and deportation to concentration camps. The fame of its methods spread rapidly, so that the threat of its intervention was enough to generate a climate of constant terror. In reality, the Gestapo didn't need to monitor everyone. It was enough for everyone to believe they could be under surveillance. Historiography has shown that this combination of myth and fear was one of the pillars of the regime. The repressive apparatus was not gigantic, but it was reinforced by propaganda, social complicity, and enforced silence. On many occasions, the Gestapo delegated tasks to other institutions, such as the regular police or the SS, which allowed it to appear to have a much greater capacity for control than it actually possessed. After the war, the image of the Gestapo was further magnified. For Germans, it was a way to explain their lack of internal resistance, as it allowed them to justify their collaboration with the Nazi regime because they had lived under the constant gaze of an all-powerful force. For the Allies, it served to illustrate the totalitarian nature of Nazism with an almost monstrous repressive body. The result was a persistent myth. The Gestapo was seen as a massive organization when in reality it was a relatively small structure that multiplied its power through fear, propaganda, and citizen collaboration. Persistent hatred. Did fascism die after World War II? In the collective memory, the Allied victory in 1945 is often presented as the absolute end of fascism. The defeat of Hitler, Mussolini, and their allies is etched as a victory not only military but also ideological. Democracy had triumphed and fascism had been eradicated. However, this vision is more myth than reality. While the Third Reich was destroyed and Italian fascism collapsed, fascist-inspired authoritarian regimes did not disappear with the end of the war. Some survived for decades, while others, albeit disguised, transformed into new dictatorships. The most obvious case was Spain. Under Francisco Franco, the Franco regime consolidated its position after the Civil War that raged between 1936 and 1939, allowing it to remain in power until 1975. Although after 1945 it avoided identifying itself with the defeated Axis, its political system retained fascist elements, such as the single party, political repression, the cult of the leader, and the use of nationalism as a tool of control. In Portugal, Salazarism also survived intact, with a corporatist and authoritarian model that lasted until the Carnation Revolution in 1974. In Latin America, the echo of fascism was felt in nationalist movements that adopted similar symbols, discourses, and structures. Military governments in Argentina, Brazil, and Chile during the second half of the 20th century, although adapted to local contexts, were inspired by repressive practices and the notion of a strong, centralized state. The end of the war did not therefore mean the disappearance of authoritarian ideas, but rather their adaptation to new circumstances. The Cold War also shaped perceptions. For the Western Allies, fascism ceased to be the main threat, and the new enemy became communism. Thus, right-wing authoritarian regimes that would previously have been associated with fascism were tolerated or even supported based on their geopolitical alignment. Franco, for example, remained in power thanks to his role as a strategic ally against the Soviet Union. In this context, the narrative surrounding fascism softened, presenting it as a defeated phenomenon, even though in practice it still persisted in various forms. Culturally, the idea that the war had put an end to all forms of fascism was comforting. It allowed the narrative to conclude with a clear ending: the defeat of absolute evil. Films, political speeches, and school textbooks reinforced this version, omitting the complexity of the international landscape. The continuity of authoritarian regimes was relegated to the background, eclipsed by the triumphant image of 1945 as a radical break with the past. Reality shows the opposite. Fascism as an ideology and as a political practice did not disappear in 1945. It persisted in European and Latin American dictatorships, adapted to new circumstances, and left deep marks on subsequent political structures. Forked tongue. Is it true that Goebbels was so effective that he convinced all Germans? The figure of Joseph Goebbels, Minister of Propaganda of the Third Reich, has become associated with the myth of a master manipulator who managed to convince the entire German people. In many subsequent representations, he is presented as a genius of deception who transformed an entire nation into a homogeneous block of obedient followers, incapable of questioning the regime's lies. However, the historical reality is less absolute. Nazi propaganda was powerful and effective, but it failed to subdue the minds of every citizen, much less erase the diversity of perceptions and resistance that existed within German society. Goebbels designed a controlled media system. Newspapers, radio, cinema, and posters all followed the official line. The messages exalted Hitler as a providential leader, demonized internal enemies, especially the Jews, and glorified military victories. The constant repetition of slogans, the use of symbols like the swastika, and mass parades generated an environment in which support seemed universal. However, this effect depended as much on the control of public space as on repression. Anyone who openly criticized him could face the Gestapo, lose their job, or end up in a concentration camp. In this sense, silence was not always synonymous with conviction, but also with fear. Later studies reveal that not all Germans blindly believed official discourse. Internal regime reports, such as those prepared by the SS security services, recorded rumors, subversive jokes, and veiled criticisms circulating in factories, neighborhoods, and even on the front lines. Propaganda could shape perceptions, but it did not eliminate the distrust or skepticism of sectors that perceived a contradiction between official messages and harsh everyday reality. Furthermore, Goebbels' success lay not in convincing everyone, but in establishing a climate in which the official narrative was the only one publicly acceptable. Propaganda functioned as an interpretive framework. Even those who doubted or disbelieved were forced to live with this language, to repeat slogans at school or work events, to exist in an environment saturated with Nazi symbols. This collective pressure created the illusion of unanimity, even if underlying fissures existed. The myth of an all-powerful Goebbels was consolidated after the war. For many Germans, it was easier to explain their inaction or lack of resistance by saying they had been victims of an irresistible propaganda machine. For the Allies, presenting Goebbels as a diabolical manipulator served to reinforce the image of Nazism as an almost hypnotic machine, capable of dominating minds on a massive scale. In popular culture, the Minister of Propaganda was transformed into an archetype of the absolute manipulator, which simplified the complexity of German society at the time. In truth, Goebbels did not convince all Germans. Propaganda was an instrument of power, but it never replaced the violence, coercion, and political opportunism that sustained the regime. But it is true that not all Germans believed what Goebbels proposed as the official story. The fragility of monsters, why Tiger tanks weren't invincible. Within the wartime imagination of World War II, few symbols have acquired as much fame as the German Tiger tanks. Designed as state-of-the-art heavy weapons, they have been portrayed in documentaries, video games, and films as invulnerable machines capable of devastating any Allied armored vehicle. The myth of their invincibility was consolidated in the post-war period, presenting them as the pinnacle of Nazi military engineering. However, history paints a much less glorious picture. Although formidable on the battlefield, the Tigers were far from invincible and were burdened by technical, logistical, and strategic problems that greatly limited their impact. The Tiger I, introduced in 1942, was a response to the Soviet T-34 and K-51 tanks, which had surprised the Germans with their durability. With an 88mm gun and thick armor, the Tiger could destroy most enemy armor before they even closed. In direct combat, especially at long range and in open terrain, the Tiger posed a formidable challenge. Its reputation alone instilled fear among Allied troops. However, this technical advantage did not make it indestructible. Tiger production was limited. Only about 1,350 Tiger Is and around 500 Tiger IIs were built, a paltry number compared to the more than 50,000 Soviet T-34s or the more than 49,000 American Shermans. The shortage of units made it impossible for the Tigers to make a difference on all fronts. They were deployed in small numbers, and their strategic impact was diluted in the face of the overwhelming numerical superiority of the Allies. Added to this were serious mechanical problems. The weight of over 50 tons caused constant failures of the transmission and tracks, necessitating frequent repairs in the midst of combat. In many cases, the Tigers were abandoned or destroyed by their own crews when they became immobilized in mud or snow. Their fuel consumption was outrageous at a time when Germany suffered chronic oil shortages. In practice, the Tiger could be as vulnerable to logistics as it was to enemy fire. The Allies also developed effective responses. Anti-tank artillery, aerial bombing, and the use of combined arms demonstrated that the Tiger could be destroyed. Even lighter tanks, if they managed to close in and maneuver, could damage it in weak spots such as the sides or rear. Over time, Allied experience neutralized the Tiger's psychological effect, and its reputation for invincibility began to crumble. The myth was consolidated after the war, when Allied soldiers recalled with fear their encounters with these armored vehicles. Literature warfare and popular culture magnified their power, presenting them as almost weapons legendary. But that image forgets that war is not won with isolated machines, but with mass production, sustained logistics, and strategic coordination. On that ground, the Tigers were doomed to defeat. Dressed to kill. Is it true that Hugo Boss was the exclusive designer of Nazi uniforms? One of the most widespread myths about the aesthetics of the Third Reich is that fashion designer Hugo Boss was the sole creator of Nazi uniforms. The image of a renowned couturier designing every garment worn by the SS and Wehrmacht has circulated in articles, debates, and social media, fueling a fascination with the sinister elegance of Nazi attire. However, the truth is more complex. Hugo Boss was not the designer, but a manufacturer that produced uniforms commissioned by the regime, along with many other German textile companies. The confusion begins with the founding of the Hugo Boss Company in 1924 in Metzingen, Germany. The firm initially produced work clothes, jackets, and civilian uniforms. After Hitler came to power in 1933, the company, like many others, benefited from contracts with the Nazi state. From that point on, it became a supplier of uniforms to organizations such as the SS, the Hitler Youth, and other paramilitary branches. However, producing did not mean designing. Nazi uniform designs were primarily designed by state design offices and other SS-affiliated manufacturers, such as Karl Diebitsch and Walter Heck, who were responsible for iconic elements such as the SS skull and stylized swastika. However, it is entirely true that Hugo Boss, as a businessman, openly supported the regime. Not only this, but he joined the Nazi Party, and his company prospered thanks to state contracts. During the war, the factory used forced labor, including prisoners of war and foreign workers, in exploitative conditions. This corporate complicity was documented after 1945 and left a permanent shadow on the brand's history. But attributing the exclusive design of uniforms to him is a mistake. His role was primarily mass production. The myth was strengthened in the post-war period for two reasons. First, the association between fashion and Nazism is particularly compelling in narrative terms. A prestigious designer behind impeccable uniforms seemed to fit the idea of a regime obsessed with aesthetics. Second, the subsequent international fame of the Hugo Boss brand, which re-emerged in the fashion world in the second half of the 20th century, magnified the historical connection with Nazism. In retrospect, it was easy to imagine that the elegance of modern suits had direct roots in Nazi design. Reality, however, shows that Nazi uniforms were the product of a bureaucratic and military apparatus that commissioned designs from various artists and producers. The imposing aesthetic sought to convey discipline, strength, and authority, but it wasn't the exclusive work of an individual designer. Hugo Boss was just one of many industrialists who grew rich making these garments, collaborating with the regime and participating in its war machine. The myth of Lebensraum, the false promise of Nazi living space upon which the Holocaust was built. One of the ideological pillars of Nazism was the concept of Lebensraum, or living space. As we have already mentioned, Hitler clearly outlined this concept in his book Mein Kampf, in which he argued that Germany needed to expand eastward to guarantee land, resources, and prosperity for its population. The idea promised Germans a future of abundance in the fertile plains of Ukraine and Russia, where a new Germanic civilization would supposedly take root. Over time, Lebensraum became a political myth that served to justify invasion, war of extermination, and genocide, although in practice it remained nothing more than an impossible promise. The myth lay in its apparent simplicity. Germans lived in a densely populated, resource-limited territory, while vast, underexploited lands stretched to the east. Conquering and colonizing these regions seemed, in Nazi discourse, a natural and even inevitable solution. However, this vision completely ignored historical and geographical reality. Far from being empty, the eastern lands were inhabited by millions of people, including Poles, Ukrainians, Belarusians, and Russians, whose existence had to be denied or reduced to servitude to make the Nazi utopia possible. The promise of Lebensraum was not only a deception for German citizens, but also an alibi for extermination. The colonization of Ukraine entailed mass deportations, planned famines, and systematic murder. The so-called Operation Hunger envisioned the deaths of millions of Soviet people from starvation, with the aim of stripping the local population of their resources for the benefit of the Reich. In this sense, Lebensraum was less a realistic economic project than an ideological disguise for violent expansion and genocide. In practice, the invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941 showed the limitations of the myth. The German army could not sustain the conquest of such vast and populated territories. Soviet resistance, impossible logistics, and the brutality of the occupation undermined any attempt at stable colonization. Far from bringing prosperity, the war in the East devoured German resources and ultimately precipitated the defeat of the Reich. The utopia of a self-sufficient agricultural empire in the East became a swamp of violence and destruction. On a propaganda level, Lebensraum functioned as a mobilization tool. Many Germans believed that conquering Ukraine would guarantee food and land for future generations. The promise was disseminated in speeches, school textbooks, and visual propaganda, always portraying the East as a natural prey for the German people. After the defeat, however, this promise was exposed for what it was, an impossible-to-sustain fantasy based on extermination and an utter disregard for the political and social realities of Eastern Europe. Ethnic cleansing, the truths and lies about the Lebensborn program that produced genetically engineered blonde babies. The Lebensborn program, created in 1935 under the direction of Heinrich Himmler and the SS, has been shrouded in mystery and sensationalism. In popular culture, it is associated with laboratory experiments, genetic manipulation, and the artificial creation of blonde, blue-eyed babies destined to form a master race. Images of Nazi scientists selecting embryos or applying genetic engineering techniques are featured in sensationalist documentaries and fiction films. However, this idea is a myth. Lebensborn did not produce children through advanced science, but rather functioned as a childbearing support program that sought to increase the birth rate of those deemed racially fit. The origins of Lebensborn lay in the Nazi obsession with racial purity. Himmler viewed with concern the declining birth rate among German families considered Aryan and feared that the future of the Reich lacked enough children to sustain expansion. Thus, the program offered financial and social support to women who had children with members of the SS or with racially suitable soldiers. These state-funded homes provided medical care, housing, and an environment where single mothers could give birth without the usual social stigma. Far from genetics laboratories, Lebensborn was more of a refuge and an ideologically controlled maternity network. Women were selected for their physical characteristics, such as light hair, blue eyes, or Nordic features, and for family backgrounds considered clean from the Nazi racial perspective. The goal was for these children to grow up as future members of the racial community idealized by the regime. Another aspect of the program was the appropriation of children in occupied territories. In Poland, Norway, and other countries, the SS kidnapped minors with Aryan features, separated them from their families, and took them to Lebensborn homes to Germanize them. These children were raised as Germans, erasing their origins through a brutal process of assimilation. More than genetic engineering, this was a systematic kidnapping and cultural indoctrination project. The myth of genetic manipulation arises in part from the subsequent confusion with Nazi medical experiments in concentration camps, where atrocities involving forced sterilization, twin experimentation, and attempts to control reproduction did occur. By merging these practices with Lebensborn, popular imagination created the idea of factories producing blonde babies conceived in laboratories, which never became a reality. In the post-war period, Lebensborn became a taboo subject. Many of the children born in these institutions suffered discrimination and stigmatization, mistakenly associated with sinister scientific experiments. The narrative of children created in test tubes was more sensational than the real explanation. An SS-supported maternity program marred by racism, forced appropriations, and ideological control. The hope of the fallen, the false idea that the Nazis could have won if they had not attacked the Soviet Union. One of the most frequent speculations in the counterfactual history of World War II is that Germany could have won the war had Hitler not decided to invade the Soviet Union in June 1941. According to this hypothesis, if the Third Reich had focused on consolidating its gains in Western Europe and defeating Great Britain, it would have avoided the collapse that led to the gigantic Eastern Front. This idea, repeated in popular books, documentaries, and historical debates, has fueled the myth that Barbarossa's strategic error was the sole cause of Germany's defeat. However, detailed analysis shows that the Reich had structural limitations that made a lasting victory unlikely, even without the invasion of the USSR. First, Germany was already engaged in a long-term war that it could not win against the United Kingdom, and since December 1941, against the United States. The industrial, naval, and financial superiority of the Anglo-Saxon allies was overwhelming. Even if Hitler had postponed or cancelled the invasion of the USSR, Germany would sooner or later have faced a coalition with vastly superior global resources. Without sufficient access to oil, raw materials, and production capacity, the Reich relied on quick conquests and lacked the economic basis to sustain a protracted conflict. Furthermore, the myth that Operation Barbarossa was a one-time mistake oversimplifies the picture. It is true that opening the Eastern Front was a strategic disaster, as the German army was trapped in a war of attrition for which it was unprepared. But logistical problems, fuel shortages, limited industrial production, and Germany's inability to mobilize colonial resources comparable to those of its enemies already existed before 1941. Even without the invasion, the Reich would have continued to face naval blockades, strategic bombing, and the attrition of maintaining troops in hostile occupied territories. The idea that Germany could have consolidated Western Europe if it hadn't attacked the Soviet Union is also dubious. Great Britain continued to resist, supported by naval superiority and the expectation of American aid. An invasion of the British Isles was practically impossible without first defeating the Royal Air Force and Churchill's fleet. In this context, time was against Hitler. The longer the war dragged on, the more the Allies' material power grew. The myth, in part, stems from a fascination with imagining an alternative outcome. The invasion of the USSR was so monumental in scale and consequence that it became a symbol of German defeat. In the post-war period, many German generals fueled this narrative in their memoirs, blaming Hitler for having deviated from the correct strategy. In doing so, they shifted responsibility to the dictator and presented the Wehrmacht as invincible in other scenarios. Real history shows that the Nazi defeat was the product of multiple structural factors, not a single decision. Barbarossa accelerated the collapse, but the disproportionate resources vis-à-vis the Allies made it very difficult to imagine a sustainable triumph, even if the Reich had avoided a clash with the Soviet Union. Hellfire. Why so many people believe the Nazis were close to building the atomic bomb. One of the most persistent myths of World War II is that the Third Reich was one step away from developing the atomic bomb, and that, had it been given a few more months, it could have changed the course of the war. This idea, repeated in books, films, and conspiracy theories, presents Germany as a nuclear power frustrated by external circumstances. However, the reality is that the Nazi nuclear program was far from reaching that level of development, and according to evidence uncovered during the conflict itself, it never came close to producing a functional weapon, primarily because it lacked the organization, resources, and knowledge necessary to do so. The myth stems in part from Germany's scientific reputation. During the first decades of the 20th century, Germany was a world center of physics and chemistry, with figures such as Albert Einstein, Max Planck, and Werner Heisenberg. When the Nazis came to power, many of these scientists emigrated, especially Jews fleeing persecution. This brain drain severely weakened the Reich's scientific potential, although later propaganda insisted that Heisenberg and other physicists remained secretly developing the ultimate weapon. The German nuclear program, launched in 1939, explored the possibility of building a reactor that would produce energy and eventually fissile materials. But it was fragmented from the start. Several teams worked in isolation without central coordination or a clear strategic plan. Unlike the Manhattan Project in the United States, which mobilized colossal resources under a unified structure, the German effort was small, with limited budgets and no priority within the Reich's military-industrial complex. One of the main problems was the supply of uranium and heavy water. Germany lacked sufficient reserves of enriched uranium and relied on the heavy water plant in Norway, which was successfully sabotaged by the Norwegian resistance and British commandos in 1943. Without these materials, progress toward a controlled chain reaction was impossible. The program was limited to laboratory experiments that never achieved the critical mass necessary for an operational reactor, much less a nuclear weapon. The figure of Werner Heisenberg, Nobel Prize winner and renowned physicist, fueled much of the speculation. After the war, the Allies interrogated him as part of Operation Epsilon, where his conversations with other German scientists detained in England were recorded. In these conversations, it became clear that the Germans did not fully understand the practical principles of building a bomb and overestimated the amount of material needed, demonstrating that they were far from achieving a viable design. The myth of the Nazi bomb served several purposes. For the Allies, it reinforced the justification for the Manhattan Project. If it wasn't developed quickly, Germany might overtake them. For the defeated Nazis, it was a way to maintain the idea that they possessed superior scientific potential thwarted only by fate. And in the post-war period, popular culture found it irresistible to imagine a scenario where Hitler almost obtained the ultimate weapon. However, the historical evidence is clear. The German nuclear program never came close to producing a bomb. It was a scattered, limited project with no practical results. The idea that the Reich was on the verge of achieving this is an exaggeration that magnifies its capabilities far beyond reality. Reich urban planning. Is it true that Hitler created motorways as a novelty for everyone? One of the most repeated claims when discussing achievements attributed to the Third Reich is that Adolf Hitler invented the German Autobahns, the famous Autobahn. In speeches, documentaries, and even in everyday conversations, it is often said that these modern roads were the Führer's personal creation and a demonstration of the regime's supposed efficiency. However, the reality is that Autobahns were not a Nazi invention. Prior projects existed in Germany and other countries, and the regime simply appropriated the idea, amplified it, and turned it into propaganda. The truth is that the concept of high-speed highways did not originate in Nazi Germany. Already in the 1920s, during the Weimar Republic, there were plans and debates about the need for expressways to connect major cities. In 1921, Italy's first modern motorway, the Autostrada dei Laghi, opened between Milan and Lake Como and Varese. Even Germany itself began experimenting with roads without intersections or traffic lights before Hitler came to power. In fact, the first German Autobahn connecting the cities of Cologne and Bonn was opened in 1932, a year before the Nazis took control of the state. What the regime did was simply appropriate the project and give it a monumental propaganda dimension. Hitler presented the Autobahnen as a personal achievement and a symbol of German rebirth. The construction of kilometers of highway became a political stagecraft. Inaugurations with speeches, aerial photographs of long, modern roads, and the idea that the Führer was leading Germany toward modernity. Work on the motorways was also used as economic propaganda. It was claimed that they would reduce unemployment, although in practice the actual impact was much less than the propaganda claimed. The Autobahnen did not only have symbolic value. The regime also pursued a military objective: to create routes that would facilitate the rapid movement of troops and war material in the event of war. However, during the conflict, the motorways proved to be less useful than expected. Most German transport was still rail-based, and the country's vehicle fleet was too limited to fully utilize the new roads. The railways proved more of a propaganda tool than a decisive logistical resource. The myth that Hitler invented the highways was consolidated after the war, when attempts were made to show that even a brutal regime had achieved advances in infrastructure. The idea that a dictator could be efficient in public works fit into a simplified narrative, which ignored the continuity of previous projects and the true scope of the plan. In reality, the Autobahnen were part of a global process of road modernization that was already underway in other countries. The persistence of this belief is due to the power of the Nazi propaganda apparatus. By claiming sole responsibility for a modern and visible project, Hitler reinforced his image as a visionary leader, capable of bringing progress along with military power. But history shows that the highways were not a Nazi invention, but rather a propaganda appropriation of a previous idea that was used as a political showcase. Sub-Zero hate the widespread lie that the Nazis had a secret army in Antarctica. Among the most extravagant myths about the Third Reich is the belief that after their defeat in 1945, the Nazis established a secret base in Antarctica where they would have continued their military experiments, preserved a secret fleet, or even created a hidden army to one day return. The legend, known as Base 211 or New Swabia, combines historical fact with conspiracy theories and has become a recurring theme in fantasy literature, pseudo-historical documentaries, and internet forums. The origin of this myth lies in a real expedition. Between 1938 and 1939, Germany sent a scientific mission to Antarctica on the ship Schwabenland. The objective was to map territories and claim areas for resource exploitation, especially for the whaling industry, vital to the supply of industrial blubber. The expedition marked a sector with Nazi flags and named it New Swabia. It was a propaganda act within the context of pre-war international tensions, but it did not involve the construction of military bases or permanent facilities. After the defeat of the Reich, popular imagination filled the void with speculation. Soviet secrecy, the documented escape of some Nazi leaders to South America, and rumors about hidden technologies contributed to the narrative that the expedition had been the tip of the iceberg of a more ambitious plan. According to these theories, German submarines had transported materials and scientists to underground shelters on the frozen continent, where they would have continued their work in secret. In the post-war period, real-life episodes reinforced the legend. Between 1946 and 1947, the United States launched Operation High Jump, a large-scale military expedition to Antarctica led by Admiral Richard Byrd. Although its official objective was training in polar conditions, the magnitude of the operation fueled suspicions that they were seeking to confront Nazi remnants hidden in the ice. Conspiracy theorists connected the dots. If the Americans were going in such force, there must be more to the scene than snow and penguins. Popular culture took care of the rest. Science fiction novels, comics, and films imagined underground bases where the Nazis experimented with flying saucers, energy weapons, and reserve armies. In these narratives, the end of the war had not meant the end of Nazism, but rather its retreat to an inaccessible location from which they could return with greater force. Over time, these stories merged with theories about UFOs and hidden civilizations, reinforcing the myth. Historical evidence, however, shows that there were no Nazi military bases in Antarctica. Germany, as early as 1939, lacked the resources to maintain permanent installations in such a hostile environment. During the war, all its efforts were concentrated in Europe and the Atlantic, and there are no serious documents to support the existence of secret polar operations. The 1938 expedition was a symbolic and scientific gesture, not a prelude to military colonization. The evolution of the beast. Is it true that the Nazis were technologically superior in every way? Another of the most persistent lies about World War II is that the Nazis were technologically superior in every area. According to this view, the Third Reich would have developed weapons so advanced that were it not for external factors, they would have ensured their victory. V-2 rockets, jet aircraft, electric submarines, and even fantastical projects like the Cannon are sighted sonic or the supposed flying saucers. This image, repeated in sensationalist documentaries and popular culture, presents Germany as a futuristic laboratory that was on the verge of changing the world. The reality, however, was more limited and contradictory. It is true that Germany produced notable innovations. The V-2s were the first ballistic missiles. The Me-262s were the first operational jet fighters, and the design of the Type 21 U-boats anticipated post-war submarine technologies. But these advances were exceptions, not the rule, and came too late to decisively alter the course of the war. In many cases, they were experimental projects with technical problems that were never fully resolved. The myth of absolute superiority ignores failures. The Tiger and Panther tanks, although powerful in theory, suffered constant mechanical failures and were produced in insufficient numbers. The V-2 rockets, despite their spectacular appeal, were more a weapon of terror than an effective military resource. Their accuracy was minimal and their cost was enormous. Supposedly secret projects, such as the wind cannon or energy weapons, never went beyond sketches and tests with no real use. Meanwhile, the Allies were perfecting practical, mass-produced systems, from the rugged Sherman tank to the B-17 bomber, that proved far more decisive on the battlefield. Another aspect ignored by the myth is internal fragmentation. Nazi industry was plagued by rivalries between ministries, companies, and leaders like Himmler, Goering, and Speer. Each promoted parallel projects that competed for resources, generating chaos and waste. Unlike the centralized and coordinated effort of the Allies, the Third Reich wasted talent on redundant experiments that rarely materialized. Furthermore, the scarcity of raw materials limited any technical superiority. Germany lacked sufficient access to oil, rubber, and certain strategic metals, forcing it to improvise lower-quality substitutes. In practice, its soldiers often relied on less reliable equipment than their enemies, especially in the second half of the war. The post-war period fueled the myth. The capture of German scientists in Operation Paperclip and their contribution to American space development, along with the Soviet fascination with Nazi technology, reinforced the idea of a Reich ahead of its time. In popular culture, this narrative was amplified to the extreme, turning Hitler into the leader of a futuristic empire defeated only by chance. The truth is more sobering and also more boring. The Nazis achieved some notable advances, but they were not superior in all fields. Their innovations coexisted with failures, improvisations, and structural limitations that prevented their experimental weapons from becoming decisive factors. The myth of a technologically unbeatable Nazi Germany artificially aggrandizes a regime that, in practice, it was unable to sustain its war against powers with greater industrial and strategic capacity. The hegemony of evil. Did Nazism succeed in uniting all Germans into a homogeneous bloc? One of the most widespread ideas about Nazi Germany is that of a society completely united around Hitler, disciplined and convinced of the National Socialist ideology. The mass parades in Nuremberg, the photographs of crowds cheering the Führer, and the mass speeches seem to depict a country united without fissures or doubts. This narrative, which was consolidated both in Nazi propaganda and in later interpretations, fuels the idea that all Germans unreservedly supported the regime. However, the reality was much more complex. Nazi Germany was crisscrossed by social divisions, silent resistance, and conditional support. Propaganda was fundamental in constructing that image. Goebbels and the regime's media apparatus took care to show only support, eliminating any trace of dissent in the official media. In photographs and newsreels, the people appeared as a homogeneous mass cheering Hitler. This visual representation was so powerful that even after the war, many assumed it accurately reflected social reality. But behind this facade lay a diversity of attitudes: enthusiasm, indifference, opportunism, and even rejection. Support for Nazism varied according to social groups and historical moments. Many young people were attracted by the promise of national greatness and by youth organizations that offered a sense of belonging. Other sectors, such as industrialists and business people, supported the regime because they benefited economically. However, not everyone was ideologically convinced. Some adapted out of fear, pragmatism, or simply because there was no viable alternative. The repression was brutal and discouraged any open opposition. Resistance existed, albeit fragmented. Intellectuals, religious figures, and some military personnel organized clandestine networks that attempted to oppose the regime, such as the Kreisau Circle and the White Rose Group. Although they were a minority and often suppressed with violence, they demonstrate that not all Germans were aligned. Even within the army itself, there were conspiracies, such as that of July 1944, which sought to eliminate Hitler in order to negotiate peace. These episodes contradict the idea of a totally homogeneous society devoted to Nazism. Furthermore, there were internal tensions. Not all Germans shared the regime's radical racist vision. In rural areas or religious communities, many accepted Hitler's leadership but held reservations about certain policies, especially those that clashed with local traditions or religious beliefs. Others simply remained silent, aware that expressing dissent could mean the prison or death. Fear generated apparent conformity, but it did not amount to full adherence. The myth of a homogeneous Germany also served its purpose in the post-war period. For some Germans, it was easier to explain inaction as the result of a collective hypnosis than to acknowledge the diversity of attitudes, complicities, and responsibilities. For the Allies, portraying an entire people subservient and united under Hitler reinforced the image of a total enemy. Thus, the myth of unanimity was etched in the collective memory, even though the reality was much more nuanced. German society under Nazism was not a monolithic bloc, but rather a network of support, rejection, and adaptation. The regime managed to project an image of absolute unity, but that facade concealed a much more complex mosaic.